Well, the man many fear is stoking a global trade war may not know all the trade facts. What a surprise. Last night, U.S. President Donald Trump was caught on tape not only admitting to making things up about trade to Prime Minister Trudeau, but then boasting about it. The CBC's Evan Dyer is here with the story and the fallout. There must be quite a bit of fallout. Evan, where exactly did Trump make these comments, and what exactly did he say?
Well, President Trump was speaking at a fundraiser for congressional candidate Josh Hawley. We hear him refer to Josh in that clip you just played in Missouri, when he appeared to brag about not knowing the facts and making them up on the spur of the moment in his meeting with Justin Trudeau. Let's listen to what he said.
This guy, good-looking guy, comes in. We have no trade deficit. He's very proud because everybody else, would get killed with that. So he's. I said, wrong, Justin. I didn't even know. Josh, I had no idea. I just said you're wrong. You know why? Because we're so stupid.
So he appeared to double down this morning in a tweet on that. He was called out after that tape was released by somebody present at that fundraiser to the Washington Post. And here's what he tweeted. He said, "We do have a trade deficit with Canada." And he went on, PM Justin Trudeau of Canada, a very good guy, doesn't like saying that Canada has a surplus versus the U.S., but they do. They almost all do, and that's how I know. And, of course, this is a line that we've heard before from the U.S. government, even from its trade negotiator, Robert Lighthizer, who has also claimed a much larger deficit than actually exists. And he's done that by inflating Canadian imports by counting what are called pass-through goods, goods which aren't actually Canadian at all, but just came through a Canadian port before entering the U.S. Today we saw President Trump's spokeswoman, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, come out and say, no, the president not only was not bragging about making up facts, his facts were correct. And she said the problem with the U.S. official statistics, which of course contradict what President Trump said there and show a clear surplus for the United States, the problem with those statistics is that they don't count timber and energy products, which of course they do. In fact, they're itemized in the U.S. breakdown as far as products and energy.
Okay, so how is the Liberal government supposed to handle this? What are they saying?
Well, they're playing it fairly cool for the moment. Let's look at the official written response from Canada's Foreign Minister. Christopher Freeland said Canada and the United States have a balanced and mutually beneficial trading relationship. According to their own statistics, the U.S. runs a trade surplus with Canada, and in fact that's true. You can find those statistics on numerous U.S. government websites. It's the same approach as Canada's taken in the past, where she stood next to Robert Lighthizer right after he's made these claims and has simply repeated the facts. We saw that there's not a lot of traction on what President Trump is saying in the United States. In fact, even his own favorite television network, Fox News, called him out on this one. Let's look at a tweet they just put out, correctly identifying the surplus last year as $2.77 billion in favor of the United States, as is repeated on many U.S. government websites and publications. That's Fox News. So not a lot of people buying President Trump's version of events today.
Thanks, Evan. Evan Dyer, CBC. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Now, Trump's own government says the U.S. enjoys a trade surplus with Canada, and now he's been caught making up facts about the an alleged deficit. So, why does Trump continue to resist the truth? Could this give Canada some leverage in the next round of NAFTA talks? Well, joining me now from Washington is the director of the Cato Institute's Herbert A. Stiefel Center for Trade Policy Studies, Daniel IKENSEN. Very glad you could join us, sir. And with me in the studio, former chief NAFTA negotiator John Weeks, who we're calling on a lot these days for obvious reasons. Daniel IKENSEN, can I start with you and ask, obviously the White House is doubling down on President Trump's charge that the U.S. has a trade deficit with Canada. And I'd like you first to get your take on what White House Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders said today at today's press briefing. Listen to this and I'll ask for your comment.
Well, the president was accurate because there is a trade deficit, and that was the point he was making, is that he didn't have to look at the specific figures because he knew that there was a trade deficit, whether they got down into the dollar amount or not. There is a trade deficit between the two countries. I don't have that number right in front of me, but I know that we have it. We'll be happy to provide it to you.
Yeah, sure. So the president is contradicting his own U.S. trade representative, apparently. Daniel Ikenson, who's in the right here, and does it matter?
This administration doesn't consider services trade to be anything. They're physiocrats. They believe that there's only value in manufactured goods, and that's all that they look at. So we do have a trade deficit, bilateral trade deficit with Canada with respect to goods trade, but when you add in services where we have a big surplus, the overall balance is in surplus. The bilateral trade accounts are meaningless. This administration has attached a lot of significance to them. They seem to think that exports are Team America's points and imports are Team Canada's or the foreign team's points, and the trade account is a scoreboard, and that when you run a trade deficit with a country, you therefore have leverage over that country because your market is more important to them than theirs is to you, and so you can extract certain concessions. And the fact that the president is boasting about making numbers up and lying, I mean, that's very disheartening. But I think it's also part of his history as a real estate negotiator where there's a winner and a loser. Trade negotiations, there aren't winners and losers. Everybody wins. You're negotiating rules of the game for the players to adhere to and to optimize. In real estate deals, you want deliverables and you're demanding certain things, and maybe it makes sense to keep your interlocutor off balance by lying and being unpredictable. It's very unbecoming. It's very tiresome and nauseating, to be frank.
Which it feels like we're kind of off balance, though, doesn't it, John? What do you make of all of this?
Well, I think it would be quite funny if it wasn't so serious. And I think one of the things that's really quite shocking about this is the president has had views for a number of years on trade agreements. He doesn't really like them. And he's been particularly fixated on trade deficits, which I agree with what Dan just said about they're not really that meaningful, and in any way our relationship is essentially in balance. But what does he know about if he doesn't know what the trade deficit is when he takes such an interest in these matters? It really raises a lot of questions about whether he really is living in a fact-free environment.
But you would know the answer to this. Sarah Huckabee Sanders said today that those figures, from the ones that we quoted from the U.S. Trade Representative, well, she said that doesn't account for timber and energy. That's just not true, is it?
Well, you have to go back and look at, which year are we talking about and so on. But my understanding is we have a slight trade deficit in trade in goods, taking everything together. Actually, we have, and this should be of some interest to Donald Trump, we have a deficit in trade in manufactured products with the United States. But when you add the services in, which he says, I think rightly, that Donald Trump doesn't pay any attention to services, when you add services in, the United States has a trade surplus with Canada. And in a modern economy, you have to count both goods and services when you're looking at what makes up trade.
I mean, you still pay money for services, right?
Of course.
So it's still trade.
And this is the future in terms of, where things are going.
Right. Daniel, you already made the point. I think this doesn't really matter. Canada and the U.S. traded, $630 billion worth in 2016. So surely this, whether it's a trade or deficit or surplus, I mean, we're talking about 1 or 2% of the annual volume. Why do you think the president is so fixated on this measure, surplus or deficit?
He's believed that the trade deficit is a problem for the United States for a long time. He surrounds himself with people who are supposed to understand economics. I'm speaking specifically of Peter Navarro, who looks at what's something called the national income identity or the national accounting identity, which tells us what we do with our national output. And it's either consumed by households, consumed by business, or consumed by government, or exported. But in that identity, we subtract imports. Because imports are already accounted for in the consumption of households, businesses, and governments. So we subtract M. Peter Navarro sees that minus sign in front of the M and infers that there is this inverse relationship between imports and GDP, so that it's bad. So the object of trade agreements is to negotiate terms where you can have a trade surplus. That's the only metric for winning, according to the Trump administration. Well, if that's the case, all countries can't have trade surpluses at the same time. So how can you possibly have trade agreements if that's the case? What you look for in the success of a trade agreement is whether overall trade has increased, imports and exports, and whether overall investment has increased. Because when that happens, that suggests that the producers, the consumers, the governments, the investors are availing themselves of these rules. And it's an endorsement that the rules are good and liberalizing if there's more trade and investment.
All right, John Weeks, you know all about negotiating NAFTA. Let's put yourself in your shoes. Say you're now renegotiating NAFTA. Does this change anything, or do you just have to tune it out?
Well, I think you basically tune it out and carry on with the negotiations. We had a bit of a discussion about this a week or so
ago. The other day, yeah.
I think that, you know, we have made a certain amount of progress, and sometimes this is forgotten on days like today. But, you know, we're trying to do two things, really, in the NAFTA negotiations. There's a renegotiation going on where the Americans are taking the approach of wanting to rebalance things, and that's the part that's proving particularly difficult. Not surprisingly, why would we want to rebalance a balanced trade relationship? But there's another component to these negotiations, and that's about modernizing the NAFTA, which is essentially bringing NAFTA into the digital age. And this is a win-win-win, definitely, for all three countries in terms of what's being done in that area. And I think the strategy the Canadian government has had of working with allies in the United States, business interests, people in Congress, state governments, this is very important, because I don't think we're really going to change Donald Trump's mind. We're not going to change Peter Navarro's mind. But I think we can work with these allies to try to change the outcome in terms of what would happen if we weren't pursuing this broad advocacy effort.
Daniel IKENSEN, is this NAFTA renegotiation going to go ahead anyway, as though none of this making up numbers had happened? Do you think it's going somewhere, or could it trip it up?
No, I think that it's still on track. I think, you know, the negotiators are beginning to try to figure out that they just need to discount the rhetoric that comes from Trump. I know, you know, it's a difficult thing to do, because he could ultimately pull the plug, and that would be a terrible thing. But there's a lot of interest on both sides in achieving a new agreement. I think 6 chapters or so are closed. They're looking to have 30 chapters to this agreement. Many of them are probably, and John would know this better than I, are probably close to completion and are just waiting for the areas that are where there are real substantive disagreements still to come closer to fruition. So things like the rules of origin and things like that. But I think it'll happen.
Okay, so do you think it'll happen, or could it still go off the tracks, John? You got 10 seconds.
Well, it could go off the tracks, but I think it will happen. I think, you know, we're the #1 customer of the United States. We buy as many goods from the United States as the entire European Union combined. Mexico is the #2 customer of the United States. I think sooner or later they're going to figure out that it makes sense to do a deal with your best customers rather than have a big fight with them.
But you're being logical. Well, thanks to Daniel IKENSEN and John Weeks. Appreciate you both taking the time. Thanks very much. Good discussion. Now,